Hey, welcome back, friends. It's Monday morning, and we're going to wrap up Nehemiah chapter 12 this morning. We're getting eerily close to finishing out the book. We've just got one chapter left, but several sections in that chapter that we're going to unpack together in the next couple of weeks. We've just finished reading about this beautiful scene of worship. It's grand in its implementation and its logistics. We've got these two enormous choirs gathering on top of the walls. They're converging at the temple in Jerusalem for the exaltation of God. And they're dedicating the completed project of the walls and the gates as an offering to the Lord. But now I want to recall, do you remember what we talked about in chapter 9? There was a lengthy prayer in chapter 9, right? And as part of that lengthy prayer, towards the end, or right at the end of chapter 9 rather, we see a commitment by the people of Israel to dedicating themselves to the promotion of temple worship. This is part of the recorded prayer in chapter 9. And so as they're promoting themselves, they're committing themselves to the promotion of temple worship. What this morning's text is going to help us see is that after this great and grand worship service, now we got to get down to business. We have to put feet to what we have said. Yes, we will promote temple worship. Okay, how are they going to do that? That's what this morning's text is going to show us. Here, the people are going to make various provisions for the temple as part of their commitment to worshiping the Lord and to seeing that his name is glorified in the nation, in the city, and beyond. The place that they have rebuilt, they want it to be the thriving place of worship it's intended to be. So let's look at verses 44 through the end of the chapter. We'll read them first and then we'll kind of unpack them as we go. It says in verse 44, "On that day men were appointed over the storerooms, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes, to gather into them the portions required by the law for the priests and for the Levites, according to the fields of the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. And they performed the service of their God, and the service of purification, as did the singers and the gatekeepers, according to the command of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers, and they set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron." So now as we start to unpack the text a little bit, we look at verses 44 first. On that day, it says, men were appointed over the storerooms, the contributions, the firstfruits, and the tithes, to gather into them the portions required by the law for the priests and for the Levites, according to the fields of the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. So, from earlier portions of the Old Testament, what they would call the Torah, the people are gaining and they're garnering their understanding of what provisions need to be procured as part of temple worship. And so what we're seeing here in verse 44, the storerooms here are being filled with the first fruits, the tithes of the people from their crops, and they're gathering them into the temple storehouses. Why? Because this is both an offering to the Lord, but if you remember way back in the earlier parts of the Old Testament, this was also the way of sustaining the Levites who ministered in the temple and in the tabernacle we see earlier on in Exodus and so forth, as they are ministering on behalf of the people. And so we know that what they're doing here in verse 44, it's coming from prescriptive texts earlier in the Old Testament, because as verse 44 says, it says required by the law. So certain amounts are being required based on fields and towns as described here in this verse. But it's important to note that these are not arbitrary offerings. But these are offerings which are specific and they're in accordance with prescriptions in the law by God for the people as part of their worship practice. So they're not just, arbitrarily deciding how much and of what. They're really trying to do this right. They want to follow both the spirit and the letter of the law here. And on top of all this, at the end of verse 44, which kind of sounds like an odd phrase, but really it does work in tandem with what's being said. The people are rejoicing over the priests and the Levites who ministered, which means they are literally encouraging and praising these men for their faithful service to them and for them. I mean, what a novel concept, right? The people are appreciating their ministers and how they serve them for God's glory and in obedience to his commandments. They know that what they're doing is a labor of love, and they are thankful to them for how they are assisting in the proper worship of God for the whole person, as it's being done in a way that pleases the Lord. So not only are they trying to do the right thing and bring the right provisions, but they are pouring out their praise on the ones who have given themselves to being ministers on their behalf. And so we see in verse 45, and they performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did the singers and the gatekeepers, according to the command of David and his son Solomon. So now there is this service of purification that's taking place. But what's important about it is not the specific of what it is, but the fact that it was instituted by David and Solomon from years before. In fact, as Jim Hamilton points out in his commentary, this is a statement of faith here, because they are following commands from a king from several generations before. And yet in doing so, they're doing this because they believe the promises that God gave to David will also be carried out on them as they follow those same commands. So what we're seeing here is a belief of the people that God was still at work, that his promises were still true, and that they wanted to see them come to pass in their lifetimes also. And then we come to verses 46 and 47 to wrap up the chapter. For long ago, and in the days of David and Asaph, there were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel, in the days of Nehemiah, gave the daily portions for the singers and for the gatekeepers. And they set apart that which was for the Levites. And the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron. So now as we look at the last couple of verses in chapter 12, we see the worship leaders which are being described in the last couple of verses. You know, the kind of worship that took place in the days of David and Asaph are purposefully being continued in Jerusalem as it has now been rebuilt. The people want to hold true to their commitment. They want to see temple worship continue. And so then there's this generational reference to tie it all together, where it says, in all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah. This phrase here, as Jim Hamilton's commentary says, it's linking these generations between the returnees with the generation of the rebuilders. But what's more important here is the contributions that are being made in light of promoting temple worship, which they had promised all the way back in Nehemiah 9. Now remember, this is not a thriving time in the life of the people. I mean, think about it. They've returned from exile. They were having to pay Artaxerxes taxes while they were living there. They were struggling to make ends meet with their own flocks and their own crops as they're trying to rebuild the wall and then tend to their own family. And on top of that, they're trying to resettle. They're trying to either restore a previous home or rebuild a new one. Some of the nobles, I mean, they're well off, but at the same time, they're not trying to get largely involved with the people. In fact, Nehemiah has to go after them because they're loaning money to people and trying to charge interest. And so, by and large, the people are on the poorer side of socioeconomics. So it's pretty safe to say that these were not people that were thriving financially, even provisionally, but they're giving sacrificially nonetheless. And that's important, because regardless of their economic status, they gave to the work of the Lord. They didn't argue about it. They didn't complain. They just simply gave. In fact, very specifically, they gave a daily portion for the singers and the gatekeepers. They are setting apart portions for the Levites and so forth. And what you don't see in the text is you don't see any argument over, well, maybe we shouldn't have that many singers. Or maybe we shouldn't have that many gatekeepers. I mean, in the interest of conserving resources, right? Whatever excuse they could think of, it's not brought into play here in the text. What appears to us is that they have set their minds on promoting the temple worship, and in whatever capacity that means, whatever capacity is required for that, they're going to give sacrificially to see that it happens. They're not going to complain about the amount of workers, gatekeepers, singers, otherwise. They're just simply going to see the need, and then from what they can, sacrificially to try to see that that need is met. Which arguably this could be perhaps the most selfless act of the people that we see recorded in the book of Nehemiah. But if only the people would have stayed that way. If only they would have kept this up for the rest of their days. Yet as we see in the unfolding of other books of Scripture leading up to the close of the Old Testament, they don't. However, there's still a lot for us to learn, as Nehemiah is going to accomplish a few more tasks just before the book comes to a close. What we're going to see as we open up chapter 13 in the next few installments is that he's going to renew this agreement of separation that they had talked about also in Nehemiah chapter 9. He's going to cleanse the temple. He's going to enforce the Sabbath, also reference back to chapter 9. He's going to cleanse the people before the book closes. And it closes in this short but sweet prayer about the future. I mean, what a journey these people have been on, right? And what a journey has been ours to try and to put ourselves in this moment in history. As God's people are gathering again in Jerusalem after 70 years of exile. There's so much that we've been able to learn along the way, and yet there's still a little bit more for us to cover as we unpack chapter 13. But we'll do that next time.